You were born for this. Hey.
Hey, absolutely. And we're back. We're live. Ready. Hey, welcome back to the podcast, guys. Thank you for joining us again this week. This week, I'm going to be doing again with my daughter, GerDonna. We're going to be talking this time about the Christian concept of purity and how that impacts everything around us.
Yes.
We want to, I'm just getting in my own head. I'm listening to the news last night and was listening to Hillary Clinton was talking about President Trump. And she says, I'm living in Trump's head. And I was like, well, who's living in whose head?
I'm like, well.
Because it just sounds to me, like you talking about him. He talking about you.
Sounds like, yeah, he's in your head.
So that brings us back to my idea today.
Right.
Talking about purity. Purity, predominantly sexual purity. But let's talk about that in the concept of getting in the head, getting in our head. Because when you think about life and purity as itself, and we think about Christianity, and it talks about sexual purity and what it means to be pure.
Right.
One of our subtitle for this thing is Behind the Why. So why do you feel that God has called us to sexual purity? What do you think the bottom line underneath all that is? And before we start talking about how it's reviewed or how it may be seen in what we refer to as the world system, let's see if we can't uncover the foundation. So won't you talk about that for a moment? Is why do you think God has called us to purity, sex in marriage and marriage only?
In marriage only? Well, I think it goes back to his idea, the truth of Jesus being the head of the church, church being the bride of Christ.
Okay.
And so marriage is a picture of Christ and the church.
Right.
And yes.
So if we start thinking about this idea, okay, because in the world, we have this idea of sex and the pleasure that's derived from sex being about self.
Right.
I was listening to a couple of presentations over the week, some TED Talks, some other presentations, people talking about sexual expression and how we have turned it to be about me. It's about how I feel, about what I want, and what my experience is supposed to be. So we have a relationship that is designed to be shared with someone else, but then we turn it on its head, and it becomes, even though it's a two-party thing, so to speak, it really becomes about me. How do I feel?
Yeah.
What do I want? How do I get what I want out of this?
You see that idea embedded in our society because everything is very much so me.
Right.
Love yourself. Find yourself.
It's the greatest love of all, right?
That's what Whitney said.
Learn how to love yourself, right?
That's what Whitney said.
And so if you think about that just as a comparative contrast, God says the great law being to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, and then to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So It's not a question of not loving yourself. That's not the issue. It's not a question of me needing to hate myself or not wanting to have the pleasure that God intends out of life, but to have everything in its proper context. Yeah. But when we do flip it on its head and it becomes about me, then it's not about my sharing, it's about my taking, it's about my getting, it's about my receiving. Right. And then if you think about that, if you explore that outward into life in the context of, let's say, as it reflects into our political views, it also then becomes about me. It ceases to be about what is the good for the whole and what's the good about me.
Right.
And that, I think, is the foundation. I think that's why when you look at the expression that God gives us on this relationship between a man and a woman to be shared in the committed relationship of marriage, and all the things that happen along with that, the chemicals that are released in your brain and your body, all those things that cause for lack of a better word, a healthy addiction, now gets loosed out into the world system, and you begin to, as Proverbs 5 talks about, the issues of your stream are spread throughout the city. So I'm hooked a little bit here, I'm hooked a little bit there, I'm hooked a little bit over here. And I have all these places where I'm anchored, that my soul, my true self, is then fractured because I am not connected as I should be. Right. I'm not getting a reciprocal that I would have in a relationship with my wife, where it's a reciprocal, it's open and it's flowing back and forth. Now it's a one-way street. I'm going here to get something. I'm going here to get something. I'm going here to get something. And if I'm taking from here and taking from there, I'm also depositing a part of myself that I then leave there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the same thing happens with this person to whom I've committed myself or connected myself with, where there's a little bit of them that's connected to me that is left there, and there's no reciprocal. And so at the end of the day, we have this great buildup for excitement and anticipation.
And you're left wanting.
You leave with less than what you came with.
Right.
And that's the whole problem behind this looseness that we see.
Mm-hmm.
But if we take it to the point where you mentioned earlier, that it becomes really about me.
Oh, yeah.
It becomes really about me. And you find yourself thinking, and every part of your life then becomes me-centered.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this coming back to the church in the Christian expression where everything in the worship service is about me.
Yeah.
You follow what I'm saying?
I was like, how many times do we hear that?
Yeah.
The music just wasn't really... I wasn't feeling it today.
And Pastor did not feed me at all today. The Spirit of God just didn't move for me today. And I see people talk along these lines, and I would look at them and I think, okay, I was in the same service you were in, and I experienced the presence of God. Mm-hmm. So what was different about my experience and yours?
That's one thing I've always thought about, and I've talked to you about this before, and I always come back to this. We will have as much of God in our lives as we want, truly. So if... I look at I've been that person, being like, I just didn't feel the Lord today. But then it's like, that's a personal problem.
Right.
What is it?
That's a you problem.
That's a me problem.
It's a you problem. That's a me problem.
So what about it in me was keeping me from experiencing the Lord?
Because then we come into God, into the presence of God, the same way we come into the sexual expression. I come here to have you make me feel a certain way. Mm-hmm. I come here with the idea that you're going to satisfy this longing in me. And so I come wanting, come taking, come grasping. But what happens is that because it's not a give-take relationship, the flow back is cut off.
Right.
And so you find yourself stagnated. And then we see this expression carrying itself on. So then we start thinking about how we begin to view people. I was knowing that we would be having this conversation. I just began to be observant and looking around. And I taught a class for the state this past week on cultural diversity. And it's going to be a little of a rabbit trail, so follow me if you will. Mm-hmm. I started off by giving the class a test. It was a 3-question test. And the first question was, what race are you? The second question was, what races make up the class that you are a part of? And the third question was, what races are represented in the community in which you will be serving? And I got the usual collection of questions of answers you might expect.
I imagine probably black, white,
Mexican.
Right.
And then what classes, or what races are in this class? Of course, black, white, Mexican, Middle Eastern, all these things. And then what races are represented in your community? You got a whole plethora of titles. And so then I turned my back to the class, purposefully denying my eyes to them. And I said, I'm going to write the first race on the board. And then we will discuss the others as they come up. And everybody's like, okay. So in big giant letters, I write HUMAN. And they're like,
oh, yeah.
And there's just this quiet that takes over the class. And I take a breath, I turn, and I say, okay, I wrote the first race on the board. What are the other ones that you guys have recognized?
I imagine, wait a minute.
Well, I don't understand. And I was like, well, okay. So we start with the misconception here. We have limited ourselves to the social construct of this idea of race, when in reality, there is only one race, which is why we can marry and have children together, because we're one race of beings. We're not separate beings, separate types. So what we're really talking about here is ethnicity. And so I brought this principle of this truth back to this concept, is that we have to come down to what is true before you can have a discussion about where you're going to go with this.
Right.
So when we talk about sexuality, that's why I come back to this basic question and say, what do you think God's purpose was for the design of sex? Because if you drift away from that, then all you get now are these social constructs. And each one of those social constructs is going to have a piece of the truth, but they're also going to be leaving that reciprocal part out, that life-giving part.
Right.
And it becomes about me. And then what happens very often is when we have a situation like that is we find that you have one person that will either be dominant in the situation, that they're always going to be predominantly getting what they want out of the situation. And you have a person who's going to be that one who's totally emptying out. And they're going to be constantly giving, trying to find that place of happiness, trying to find that place of satisfaction to where they lose their personhood in this relationship. And the other person constantly is trying to find themselves by suppressing or taking from the other person. But at the same time, they're both going through that same emptying process. So now if we come back and we ask the question, sexuality, how do we see this expressed in the world? Now, last time we talked about Christianity expressed on the university. So as you're out in the world, in university in particular, how do you see sexuality expressed?
In so many different ways. I mean, it is so tied to identity. It's hard to, I feel like sexuality today, especially like on campus when we talk about it, it is like very, 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 very important to people. For instance, one gal I heard, they're trying to reclaim words, they say. So like slut. Right. That's a big one now. They're like, when we say slut, what do you think? You know, people typically have to,
it's a person, particularly you think about a female who's sexually loose.
Right. That's typically, right? And it's not like an awesome thing. It's actually sad, okay? But they're saying, no, a slut is a woman who's in touch with herself. She's in touch with who she is, and she's just, all about herself, and it's great, and we should be like, you go, girl. I'm like, really? Okay. So what I've seen is this kind of, even a perversion of dignity, and there's no shame.
Right.
And which is really interesting. I heard someone else talk about this, that especially in today's society, we talk about sexuality. What they want to do is eliminate shame.
Right.
I'm not going to feel guilty about anything. If it's your normal, that's good. So then you can do whatever you want. And guess what? It's okay. Because if you're in touch with yourself, boo-boo, that's all that matters. But then you just see how it does. It tears apart society. It tears apart yourself, really.
So one of the things that I experienced when I was working in sex crimes investigations is that when I would watch, especially little girls, it was so much more prevalent or visible with little girls, is that when they were little and let's say prepubescent and they were sexually abused, they knew something was happening to them, although they may not have known in the context of it being bad. Because very often sexual abuse is not painful. It's not painful. The person who's abusing the child needs the child to be their first line of defense. Right. So if they're hurting the child is more likely often going to be able to confess or complain about that. So the groomer then will try to make the experience as non-painful. It's about as sedate a way as I can say that. So they're not necessarily connecting it to a sexual experience because they're prepubescent. But what happens is that after the young lady begins to go through the change in her life, she goes through puberty and she begins to wake up sexually. And now she has an understanding of what sex is. And she has an innate understanding, an internal idea as a persons, that this sex is supposed to be something special. But this has already happened to her. So she may be sitting in a classroom where people talk about, purity or virginity and all these kinds of things. And she's thinking, well, what does that make me? Right. If I've already had sex, if I've already done this stuff. And because she's thinking from the first person perspective, these are things that she's owning. So it's what I did and so she's claiming the abuse that was done to her. She puts that on herself. So when we find that we don't bring that out and we identify for what it is, that concept of shame then begins to empower a destructive life experience. Right. Very often this young lady will either begin to pursue self-harm, self-abuse in the sense of cutting or other destructive behaviors in that regard, or she becomes very promiscuous in the sense that I'm going to try to use this thing now called sex to get the power that was taken from me. Again, and now keep it in your background of your mind that this process is emptying out.
Yeah, you're still not.
So as much as she does this, she gets more and more empty. And so we have this concept that comes in, and now shame comes into play. Now, I can see why certain persons might say, well, if we just get rid of shame, then she'll feel better. Mm-hmm. She'll feel better about what happened and what she's experienced. She doesn't have to feel bad about it. And he goes, no, that's a misapplication. The shame that is experienced, especially from the person who's been victimized, mm-hmm. then allows them to come in and say, okay, something bad happened to me. So now you take that shame and you use it to bring in the healing. This part that says, yes, something bad happened to you, but you're not the bad thing.
Right.
You may have been victimized, but you don't have to be a victim. Mm-hmm. And you begin to give herself back to her, but you don't do that by ignoring what has happened. Mm-hmm. So now when you get older, if you take away the concept of shame and you're out there on your own, what is left then to bring balance to your behaviors or balance to you? So if you're a young man or you're a young woman, you're sleeping around and you feel no shame, then what's to stop you from being promiscuous? What's to cut down then on the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases, mm-hmm. or just the broken heart or the bad consciousness, that phone call that never rings, never mm-hmm. comes through.
Really, when you look at it, we've said this before, but following God's practical, mm-hmm. oftentimes you can see it as like, oh, another thing you can't do, another rule. But it's like, actually, no, it's for your good.
It's always for your good.
It's so that you don't feel empty. It's mm-hmm. so that you feel you are a whole person.
You don't get that brokenness.
You
say this, it reminds me, I was also teaching that course on cultural diversity, and mm-hmm. that was a segment of a video that we had watched. It was from a video series done by ABC. And it was the America's Story this century. And it goes from 1900 up to 1999. And it just takes it in 10-year increments. And so because of what the predominant age of the class that I was teaching, we used this segment from 1980 through 89. Mm-hmm. Because most of the people in that class, all the people in that class were either born in 88, 89, and then in the 90s. So this was the generation that generation was where they were being born. Those things that happened in that decade is what fashioned the world they grew up in. And so one of the things we talked about there is in the early 80s that was when the AIDS epidemic really hit America. And if you remember, you don't remember, you weren't there, no. But the fear that happened in America, that AIDS is like everywhere and was like so bad. Mm-hmm. But then it became realized that AIDS was predominantly something happening in the homosexual community. And there was this uproar out of the homosexual community that the American government had to do something about this. They had to find a cure. They had to fix it. And one of the complaints that was brought forth, and I forget the gentleman's name, who was speaking on behalf of the homosexual community, was that Ronald Reagan and his cabinet weren't taking this serious, because it was something happening to the homosexuals. And it was a lifestyle that most people thought was deviant. Mm-hmm. It was a lifestyle most people thought was unnatural.
Right.
And as they were talking, this person, and I was thinking about, could he say this today on TV? Again, talking about moving the foundation away. He goes, here we were dying by the thousands. At one point, 100,000 deaths had been accounted to AIDS. And he was saying that here we were dying by the thousands, and there was no help. He said we had been pushing the limits. And this is a phrase that caught my attention. He said, we had pushed the limits so far that now nature had turned against us. We had done something so unnatural or so unusual that nature itself turned against us, and we were crying out for help. Wow. And I thought, I wonder if you could get away.
I don't think so.
On saying homosexual relationships were against nature today.
Huh.
I wonder how that would play. And I can only imagine there are some people who are maybe watching the podcast right now and hear me say that homosexuals against nature. Oh my gosh, you bigot, you closed-minded, homophobic, and all these other things. And I am saying to you, no, I am not afraid of homosexuals. And I'm not going to give you the old line, well, I got friends who are gay. That doesn't change anything. Okay. People say it all the time, I'm not prejudiced, I got black friends. Okay, whatever.
Like, that means nothing, though.
And so, but the point of the matter is that this expression was said by people who are part of the community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's not homophobic to say it's not natural, in the sense that men and women obviously kind of fit together.
Right. Design.
And also you kind of need a man and a woman to procreate.
Right.
So if you had a society full of only homosexuals, it wouldn't be long before they were all gone.
So now we come back to this point again, because I'm not targeting homosexuality. That's not the point of the discussion. The point is sexual expression, and that God says is only intended for a man and a woman in marriage. So we have all these divergent ideas, homosexuality being one of them. Then we have the ideas of that you can have two homosexuals who are married and then limit sex to inside of marriage, and that's okay. And all those arguments make sense on the me-you level, because who am I to tell you how you're to live? Who am I to tell you who you are to love? I don't have that authority. And I will admit here right now, I'll say this, that I do believe that same-sex attraction is a very real thing. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to deny that. I think that same-sex attraction is as real as heterosexual attraction. I think that same-sex acting out is as wrong as heterosexual acting out when it's outside of God's plan. So it's not a matter of one being good and one being bad. It's the context and way things happen. And there's only one context in which sex is correct, and that is in marriage between a man and a woman. So we go back to this bigger idea of how this changing of the foundation is never one thing. So once that changes idea about sex, you understand that that's part of a bigger campaign to where everything else is connected to it. Because out of that also then is born the abortion issue.
Right.
Because if I'm having sex indiscriminate now and I'm one guy and I got 5 girls pregnant over town and I can't take care of any of them because I don't have a decent job or I don't have a relationship with them, now these girls are stuck with babies that they may not be able to take care of and don't have a daddy in the house. And we do know, as a matter of study, a fact, that the single biggest indicator whether or not a child, especially a young man, will become a juvenile delinquent is what?
Father in the home.
Absence of the father in the home. And so we can see that. We can go all the way back to this and say, okay, no daddy in the home, there's a much better chance that this boy is going to grow up and be a criminal element. Because he's got to find that paternal connection somewhere. So if he doesn't have it at home, he's going to look for it in the streets. That's
why I think it's important to look beyond sex.
Right.
People get so focused on it. That's why, I mean, even in the movement on campus that I see in the classroom, the whole liberal kind of mindset or this kind of critical perspective, critical theory that you see, a lot of it goes back to sex.
Right.
But even that, it's just an expression of a much deeper issue. Right. And so I'd say don't even get hung up on sex. So many people do. I'm like, it goes so much deeper than
sex
that.
Is the symptom of the acting out.
Yeah, but it goes deeper. I mean, there's issues that we talked about, responsibility, the lack of shame, wanting to normalize things that are deviant or are not fruitful. Right. And that's what it really is. Sex is just the expression.
One of the things we talk about when I teach a class on manhood, on teaching young boys how to transition out of this funky thing called adolescence. Again, a social construct that we are allowed to indulge in due to our affluence as a society. We have the ability to let children stay in that quasi-childhood state for an additional 10 years, 8 years or so, depending.
I mean, as long as you let me live at home.
Right. I don't have to have that responsibility, right? And we, as a society, encourage men, especially men, to remain adolescent. We have such an emphasis now on this new feminist movement that where is really a man-hating. I think, in my opinion, it's a life-hating movement because it's elevating womanhood to the point of extinguishing manhood. And you can't have one without the other. That's the perversion thought that we get to if we get away from that foundation. To have a tyranny of femininity is just as equally bad as the tyranny of manhood. They're both evil. You can't have one dominant over the other. And if you see the pattern that God has created, we find that does not exist. The things that people accuse Christianity of teaching really are perversions of the Christian doctrine. We do talk about headship, but that's not the same thing as dominance, and that's a different thing. So when we go back to this, we talk about manhood. One of the things I talk to my young men about is that we look at America as being part of this, what we call this neoclassic culture. Because our foundation of our culture, this Western culture, is built on the foundation that came out of Rome and Greece, that the rise of the Western culture. So when we look at Rome as a whole, it's very similar to America in a lot of ways. Rome was the single dominant world power when it was at its axis. And here we find ourselves today as the single dominant world power while we're at our axis. But we find there were things that Rome began to do that led to its downfall. One of the things that it did, the first thing it did that stood out on the list was that it was a moral decline. There was a moral decline. Sex at any cost. I mean, there was all kinds of sex was freely available. Only thing you couldn't do necessarily was rape a person. Right. You couldn't rape a free person. Of course, a slave could not be raped because the slave had no rights. There was sex available with children if they were sold into slavery. That was openly sold on the market. Bestiality was part of their lifestyle. Abortion was rampant. A lot of people don't understand that abortion is not a 20th century invention, that in first century Rome, abortion was so prevalent that at one point Caesar had to step in and say, guys, the national population of Romans, of true Romans, are declining. We're not having enough babies to replenish ourselves because the licentious lifestyle of young men just going out having sex with all these different women was the way to go. And so we had, again, denied fatherhood in the home. We once again took the responsibility from men of having sex with women. And so these men were like, yeah, if I can just have sex with whoever I want with no obligation, what the heck? Yes. And so these Roman Greek orgies type things where this very licentious lifestyle became so commonplace. And so what we find then is that more and more women begin to have abortions. And the laws were such that she could have abortion almost any time she wanted, as long as it was healthy for her. And if the baby was born and she didn't want it, she could literally throw it away. She could put it in the trash can. She could bury it in the yard. She could throw it in the rocks. That's one reason
why I think it's so important to remember there's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new.
So even, you look at things happening in America today and it's like, oh my gosh, are they crazy? But it's like, this has happened before. And in the classrooms I'm sitting in, they're talking about these things. And we're reading articles that were written or books that were written by people years and years and years ago. And a lot of it does center around decriminalizing any type of sexuality.
It's funny because you hear the conversation people talk about, well, we got to be concerned about population control. And I was thinking, that must be a 20th century idea because of the simple fact that, we got more people on the face of the earth now than we've ever had. So obviously this must be a 20th century kind of, 21st century kind of thing. But then I begin to read as I was doing research on this abortion issue in the first century, and I find that Aristotle, the great thinker, was a great proponent of abortion as a means of population control. So I'm thinking, wow, Aristotle bought the same lie that Planned Parenthood has taught us now through Ms. Sager about population control.
And that's hilarious because even I hear students even say that they don't want to bring children to the world because we're already overpopulated. And I'm like, where are you getting this information from? Like,
again, we're being told stuff that we don't really think through because the people who are telling us, we accept them as responsible people. I was listening again online, listening to different newscasts. There's this congressman out of Alabama,
Birmingham, Alabama,
who's saying now that you either kill them now or kill them in the electric chair, as there's no other options. We either kill the babies now in the womb or we let them turn 18 and 20 and kill them in prison. So there's no other options. That's what you're saying. So we don't go back and say, okay, let's curb the problem.
We don't go back to say, maybe someone should take responsibility for the choices they made.
Yes.
Brandon Tatum, he just put out a video and he said, I'm pro-choice and I'm pro-life. Mm-hmm. He's like, let me explain. He's like, I'm pro-life. Life begins at conception in the womb. I'm pro-choice because the choice was made in the bedroom.
Exactly.
Like, take responsibility for your actions.
When you take that foundation away, that's what I'm saying. When you take that foundation away from truth, then you get all these deviant ideas that comes out that says, I can have sex with anything I want, anybody I want, anytime I want. And then, okay, what are the consequences behind that? If we get past the connection that happens between the two people who are sexually engaged, now we go to what if there's a third? What if there's a child created out of that? Mm-hmm. So now, do I burden the female with the responsibility of just getting rid of my seed? Now she's going to kill her baby and she has to deal with the emotional ramification of the fact that I killed my child. So eventually you come back to that. And so you look at all these kinds of things and we don't go back to what's real, don't go back to what's true, then those what I'm looking for, the consequences begin to pile up. Right. So then we have people say something as idiotic as this: murder the child in the womb or kill him in the electric chair after he's committed crimes.
Instead of let's teach people how to be responsible
all along the line.
And to value life.
We start at the beginning. There's a responsible way to engage in sex.
Yeah.
So if we do that, now we eliminate the problem of having to kill the baby in the womb because we're having responsible sexual relationships. And when I say responsible, I don't mean using a condom. Mm-hmm. I mean responsible in the sense of having sex in marriage with a design for family. Mm-hmm. If you're doing that, then we take away that responsibility, that burden. Secondly, if a child is brought forth into life, now we have to have a father in the home raising that young man, teaching him what it means to be a man, how to be responsible, so that as he grows up, he then becomes a productive part of society. We think about this in the big picture. Again, we said this last time, somewhere between 53 and 60 million Americans have been killed through abortion. Mm-hmm. Think about that. Through the idea that over these last 30 years or so, a small nation of people have been murdered. Now, that's what it is. I know it hurts people's feelings when we say that. Mm-hmm. Murder is the unjustifiable taking of a human life.
Right.
It's not just killing the baby, because I can kill a baby by accident. I can hit a baby with a car, kill by accident. If I kill it with forethought, it's murder. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about here now is murder. I know it's legal in this country, but the proper term for it is murder. Okay. The laws of the land says you can do it. I'm not arguing about that right now. That's a different discussion for a different day. I'm talking about the act itself. So we now have killed somewhere near 60 million babies, of the ones we can account for, since Roe v. Wade. And we would listen to this thought, especially of this congressman whom I had never heard of before. He said this, that the only other option is to kill them now or kill them later. So there's no turn in between. There's no place where we educate and train and teach them to be proper, responsible young men. There's no place where the Father comes back and speaks into their lives. There's no place where we teach them to observe the truths of Christianity, which would on itself turn it's the destiny of that child's life. So when we go into this, when we accept this idea that the foundation for sex is that God has designed for us is whacked and way off the table, then all you're left with are bad choices. Mm-hmm. All you're left with is bad choices.
Well, I heard one person say too that basically this whole abortion thing, so with this elevation of womanhood, the woman wanting to be basically the head, and what this has done, they've seen men being able to walk away unscathed from a pregnancy. So, well, a woman should be able to walk away unscathed from a pregnancy, and that's a justification for abortion. But it's like, yeah, but you're not unscathed.
You're not walking away unscathed.
In fact, you're wounded. You talk to certain women, and the whole shout your abortion thing. Mm-hmm. I'm like, you look miserable. Yeah. You might say you're loving your life, but you look miserable.
I had the opportunity to interview this young man. He was, and I won't give any names, but he was a hitman for the gorilla family, the black gorilla family. For those who don't know, in the California penal system, there were three large gangs that kind of ruled in the California prison system. You had La Familia, you had Nuestra Familia, the gangsters, the Mexican gangs. Then you had the Aryans, which were the white gangs, and then you had the black guerrilla family. So what would happen is that in the prison system, predominantly the Mexicans and the Aryans would kind of link up together. At one point, Joe Morgan, as a matter of fact, a white guy, was the leader of the Mexican mafia. I mean, he was the head man, a white guy was. So they guys would link up together. And what would happen in the prison system is that the black guerrillas would then link up with the Asian gang. So that's how they kind of kept parity, and they kind of had this truce amongst each other while in the prison. Well, I had a chance to interview one of the hitmen for the guerrilla family. At the time that I interviewed him, we had him on record as having killed 27 people. And I asked him one time when we were talking, I said, does it ever bother you? He goes, no, it doesn't bother me. He goes, they had what coming. They had it coming. I said, so really? I said, you're locked down in the shoe at Pelican Bay, and you only get a half hour out a day. So then it's late at night and there's nobody there, and it's just you locked in with your thoughts. I said, does it bother you then? And he got mad. He said, did anybody care about me when my old man hang me by my feet in the closet and beat me with a hose pipe and leave me hanging upside down for hours at a time? Anybody care about me then? I looked at him and I said, whoa, ratchet down, brother, ratchet down.
So he goes,
forget I said that. Forget I said that. I said, oh, no, we don't forget that. And I called his name.
Yeah.
And I said, you tell me it doesn't bother you at all when you think about the abuse that you received, and then you think about those 27 lives you ended. And he said, well, he goes, it's like this, Ellis. He said, I'm the consequence. And when people sign a contract with the family, and if they don't do what they're supposed to do, they know that I'm the consequence. I'm coming after them. Mm-hmm. He said, and they're going to get it. He goes, I said, but none of it bothers you? And he kind of lowered his head and he said, sometimes. Mm. He said, but especially those last two, because they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I looked at him, I said, oh, so there's a person inside there. He goes, man, get out of here. Get out of here. Don't be telling nobody that.
Isn't that mind-boggling? I think it's easy to forget when we see especially heinous people who are, they kill, they take lives, but yet they are a person that God loves, that Jesus died for. Right. And you have to remember that, because you're saying this story and I'm like, you feel for him, even though it's like, oh, what a nasty man. I'm happy he's in jail. Yeah. But yet it's like, he was once a child that was abused. And I was like, there's a reason, that's like, don't hurt children. Like, come on, they have a future, and you're setting people up for failure.
Whitney had that part right. Children are the future.
Whitney had that part right. You got
to raise them up and teach them how to walk their way. You got to
give them a sense of pride. Yeah,
that part was right. But I find that when we have these things that we don't see, what's her name, Glennon?
Glennon Doyle. Oh my gosh.
Glennon, you were wrong. I'm just sorry. You were wrong, Glennon. You're not smarter than God. So when we put ourselves in a position, guys, when we start rejecting the truth of God, especially about our sexuality, because it's so basic to who we are. We are sexual beings.
FYI, since you're just like passing the Glennon Doyle thing, what happened was on Twitter, Glennon Doyle had tweeted out that she wanted to close the gender gap. No, the gender divinity gap.
Oh, the gender divinity gap.
And so she calls God a she and her and whatever. It's weird.
It's crazy.
It's weird.
Cray.
So that's what he was talking about.
That's what we're talking about. And so she's going to say God's going to be a woman from now on. No, you're not smarter than God.
That's another thing, how often we apply current terms today to things in the Bible. Different historical contexts, people trying to say Jesus was a progressive. It's like, no. Like, stop trying to apply things. No, you're trying to make it fit your narrative. Right. Stop it.
It's like when they take the civil rights movement and say that it was something completely. No. The civil rights movement did what it was supposed to do. Blacks can vote now. We can live where we want to live. We have equal opportunity. Right now, there are, in 1969, guess how many black billionaires there were in America? Take a guess.
None.
Look inside that hole.
Oh,
Zero.
Yeah.
There's a number of black Americans today. Yeah. We look at it amazes me. I'll be watching a sporting event. As you know, I'm a huge Laker fan. But I listen to people like LeBron James and I listen to these guys, even like my secondary team, the Golden State Warriors, and they talk about President Trump, the things that he's having. I'm like, guys, stop being so emotional and think about it, about how we are oppressed as black people. And I'm looking at this court, and there's like 10 millionaires running around on the floor.
I wish I was oppressed like they're oppressed.
I'm like, there's 10 millionaires running around on the floor playing a game for a living, and yet they're oppressed. I'm like, how in the heck are you oppressed when you got 6 houses? You're getting paid millions of dollars. You're getting millions of dollars from commercial ads. You can go anywhere, do anything. Yeah. How are you oppressed? And yet we're oppressed. And like, no, you're not. Our problems are our problems. You know, I know this is not about the black issue today, but our problems are our problems in the sense that we have got to own ourselves. I think about my own life, and I think about my uncle, who is probably the greatest man that I experienced, my Uncle Silas. I watched him from afar. And he was married to my mother's only sister. And I watched him raise his family. And he wasn't a perfect man. Nobody's perfect. Nobody. But I watched him. He would go to work every day. And I watched him come home. Sometimes I would be visiting. He'd come home from work. He'd be tired. And he'd take a shower. And he'd eat. And he'd go to bed.
And do it again.
And he'd do it again. And he would work hard. But he was such a nice man. Now, you didn't want to get a whipping because Uncle Silas could get it on you when you needed it. But every Sunday, Uncle Silas didn't send his family to church. He took them to church. Uncle Silas didn't sit in the back of the church and sleep. He was a deacon. He was involved in the functionings of the church. He worked, and he loved his wife. And then when we came home, we played. We had fun. I mean, some of the best parties I've ever gone to have been the Ellis Burrell parties, man. We would have parties out in the basement of the house on 500 million. I ain't going to give I almost gave an address. Scratch that from the tape. But we would have parties in the basement of the house that just rocked the world. And we would just be family having fun. See, he was a man that I was allowed to watch love his wife. And one of the things I saw with Uncle Silas, and it was one of those afternoon barbecue parties. And I was sitting around my mom watching, because I like to watch the grown folk because I was just nosy like that. And I watched my auntie walk out of the house. And I saw Uncle Silas look at her from the time she came out that back door. And she walked down in front of me. He had this look on her like she was the finest thing he ever seen in his life. He looked at her, and now she had had 7 children. They've been married for, gosh, by that time, at least 30 years maybe. He looked at her like she was a drink of water on a cold day. I'm on a hot day. I was like, man, I never seen a man look at a woman like that. And I'm looking at him. He's watching his wife. And I'm looking at the kids. And I'm like, that is really, really cool. I didn't have a word for it at the time. I'm just watching it. You know, I'm about 12 or 13 years old. But I'm looking at him looking at his wife. And I'm going, this man loves his woman. And that's the fidelity. That's what comes out of doing love, doing sex correctly. And I remember when I went back for their 50th anniversary, and my aunt was reciting her vows to him, and she was so proud to say, he's my lover. And I thought, 50 years, and they still sparkle for each other. I'm like, that's what God has in store for us. That's what we lose when we give away the foundation of life, when we give away the idea that I can have this monogamous relationship that have it become fruitful and more eventful over time. But when we substitute or we give away the truth, then what we're stuck with is deviancy. We're stuck with deviancy. And so instead of having depth, we have variety. Right. So instead of having that
breadth, no depth.
Instead of having that satisfaction that I saw in my uncle's face, now God knows, nobody's perfect. But I saw that, and that set my course as a young man more than anything else. That I want to say that one event, but it wasn't that one event. It was all of those together. But that stood out. It's like, that's what I want. I want that in a relationship. And so when I saw that in him, I'm thinking, there's something special about that. Right. There's something special about that. And that put a hunger in me to have that.
You know, I think that's missing in a lot of young people today. I know I've had the example of you and my mother, who've been married for how long?
36 years this year.
36 years.
36 years.
And yes, and you both sparkle for each other.
Candle. Yes, she does.
You know, but I see that. And I've been real picky about the people I allow, to come into my life because I don't want to try everything out. No. But that is really promoted in our culture of, try it out, see if it works for you.
Dip in that
and
pool.
I'm like, I don't want that,
we don't want that.
It's like, wait to find that special thing,
Grandma used to tell me when I was a kid, she said, don't marry no fool. And I said, what? She said, life's going to be hard on you as a black man. She says, hard in this country as a black man. That's the truth. That's a fact. She said, so you don't want to be fussing and fighting all day just to make a living and then come home and fuss and fight all night.
Right.
She said, don't marry no fool. Marry somebody who's going to support you and be with you.
Yes.
And that's what I did. I married a woman who loves me. And as I was talking to one of my partners at work, one of the things I learned when I first met my wife, and this is for you young ladies out there, when I met my wife, I realized something was true about her. She didn't need me for anything. She had her own money. She had her own car. She had her own space to live in.
Which means she chose you.
She didn't need me for nothing. And so, she's young, she's beautiful, and she loved the Lord. That was the first thing I noticed about her, was that she loved God. And so as we began to know each other, I was like, wow, this girl is not like anyone I've ever met before. So what is so different about her? And so I began to explore her as a person, and I began to look at what made her thrive. So when things happened in her life, she did not look to me to fix them. She didn't look necessarily to her dad to fix them, although her dad was a very awesome, and still is a very awesome man. He taught her how to do things. When her car needed oil change, she just changed the oil.
Yeah, she's the one that showed me how to fix my headlight.
When her car needed tuning up, she just tuned it up. She didn't come and say, oh, honey, can you tune up my car for me because I'm a little girl? No, none of that. She went and tuned the car up. And I was like sitting on the sideline going, well, that's kind of my job to be able to know that stuff. Not that I knew how to tune up a car. Don't get me wrong. No. But I was like, well, I'm the guy,
But she knew.
And so I had to come back and say, this girl don't need me. And yet she wanted to be with me.
Right.
And so when it came time for us to make a life
that flips modern feminism on its head. That's so cool.
That's what I'm saying.
Let me tell you.
So when it came down to us getting married, I was like, I have somebody standing beside me. She's not
beneath
I'm not
you.
Dragging her behind me because she needs me. No, she could do
and that's
life.
the complementary relationship. She's not below you.
No.
She's a support to you. And I've seen that example, and that's what's cool because she is. I would look at my mother and be like, she is a strong, independent woman.
Exactly.
You don't cross her.
No, not today. Not today.
But she's a support and a silent strength,
little,
really. That's how her personality, at least.
She wasn't raised in Geraldine's house. She got a little Geraldine in her.
Right. Yeah.
But that's the whole point with this thing. When you do it God's way, you have these foundational truths. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Remember, stop by, subscribe, like. Let's have an honest conversation because I think the truth will out. Thank you. Till next time. Peace.